of national climate justice leaders from organizations, from alliances and networks who are representing climate-impacted Indigenous, Black, and people of color, frontline communities in Turtle Island, are known as so-called United States and Canada, North America. We are honored to have this press conference in the original homelands of the Indigenous peoples of the Shinnecock and the Lenape peoples. We are here participating in the New York City Climate Week and this press conference to talk about what climate injustice is, climate reparations, inherent Indigenous rights, just transition, and the need for a national and global emergency for a phase-out of fossil fuels. You will hear presentations denouncing false solutions of climate mitigation, such as carbon capture and storage, carbon markets and offsets, geoengineering technologies, nature-based solutions, nuclear power, biomass energy, and biofuels, hydrogen energy, and more that are being pushed inside the upcoming UN Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit and advanced by corporate, governmental, big NGOs, and the banks. Listen to those on the front lines demanding real climate action from the US and Canadian governments. So the lineup for our speakers will be the following. Ariel Deranger, who's sitting on my left. She is the Executive Director of the Indigenous Climate Action, is our sister organization based in so-called Canada that campaigns around the belief that Indigenous people's rights and knowledge systems are critical to developing solutions to the climate crisis and achieving climate justice. The second speaker will be on my right, Anthony Rogers Wright. He's a spokesperson of the Black Hive. The Black Hive is at the heart of the movement for Black lives, climate and environmental justice work. The Black Hive are a cohort of Black climate and environmental justice experts who use their collective experience and knowledge to assess how climate change and ecological destruction impact Black communities in the US and across the global Black diaspora. Our next speaker will be, I got these numbered, Julia Bernard. She's the Executive Director. She's at the end on my right-hand side of Pueblo Action Alliance, based in so-called state of New Mexico, who are descendants of Pueblo indigenous revolutionaries and carry the revolutionary spirit of the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. 1680 to infinity is the date that I see them put out there. It's a community, they are a community-based grassroots organization that protects Pueblo cultural sustainability and community defense by addressing environmental, climate, and social impacts in Indigenous communities. Our next speaker will be Dawn Wells Clybourne, and she's on my left, and she is the Executive Director of Push Buffalo. It's a member organization of and representing the Climate Justice Alliance. Push Buffalo advances racial, economic, environmental justice, and affordable housing in Buffalo, New York. Our next speaker will be Adrienne, sitting on her left. And Adrienne is our policy director with the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. It's an alliance of over 60 US-based grassroots organizing groups comprised of working and poor people and communities of color and Indigenous peoples, bringing together US-based groups and global social movements working for climate justice, gender justice, and an end to war and a just transition to the next economy. Our next speaker will be on my right. would be Mohiba Ahmed, is a community organizer with Drum. Desis Rising Up and Moving, based in New York City. Drum is a multi-generational, membership-led organization of low-wage South Asian and Indo-Caribbean immigrants, workers, and youth. Mohiba will be speaking about the impact of the climate crisis in their homelands, in the U.S. as working class people and migration. So those are the ones that will be on this press conference. And I'm proud to be able to help moderate this press conference. And our first speaker, I'm going to turn it over to Ariel.
Thank you, Tom. Masicho. Iklanete, dene sotlaneta, Ariel Tsaekwe Hushe, Duranje Betsi Ni Hasli, Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, Holtsi Helsi. My name is Ariel Tsaekwe Duranje, and I'm a member of the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, which is located in the Treaty 8 territories of northern so-called Alberta. And we are downstream from one of the largest industrial projects on planet Earth, the Alberta tar sands. I'm also the executive director and co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action, and I'm really happy to be here today, and thank you for inviting me and to all the organizers for putting this together, and of course recognizing the traditional territories of the Lenape and the Shinnecock Nation. Sorry, thank you so much. I think it's really important for us to be having this conversation as global leaders are here to talk about this Climate Ambition Summit. Because what are the ambitious targets that they're trying to achieve? The ambition that I feel that they are trying to push forward right now within the negotiations here, that they are going to bring forward into the UNFCCC negotiations and the COP in Dubai later, are simply to find false solutions to allow them to continue business as usual. For over 30 years, we've seen negotiations, and there's still a refusal to accept or address the fact that there is a colonial, insatiable need for the continuation of fossil fuel expansion that's driven by corporate greed and capitalism. The IEA has indicated we cannot have any more fossil fuels if we can even have a chance at limiting global climate to 1.5. Yet, all of the UNEP countries are committed to expanding fossil fuels rather than finding ways to phase out and reduce their emissions. What we're seeing is not ambition for targets to reduce emissions. We're seeing ambitions that are rooted in false solutions and technologies that only allow them to continue corporate greed and colonial power. What this has resulted in is communities like my own, the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, a Dene Sotlene community that has a strong culture and pride and a history that spans millennia, and our relationship with the Delta where we come from. My community exists in what is known as the Peace Athabasca Delta and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the Wood Buffalo National Park, which is now listed as a threatened park because of the continued expansion of fossil fuels and other extractive industries and false solutions like mega hydro. We are not seeing the protection of our critical biodiversity on this planet and the communities that live in relationship with it, like my own. The Athabasca Chippewan First Nation are Dene, and when you break down the word Dene into its root words, the word means to flow from the earth. The chief of my nation once said, if you are to destroy the Delta, then who are we? Our traditional name is the Kaitale Dene Sotlene, which means the people of the willow and the people of the land. And yet every year, instead of phasing out of fossil fuels, our country is committed to doubling down and continuing to approve and approve and approve more and more expansion of one of the dirtiest fossil fuel projects on the earth. Yet my community is not alone. This is happening across the globe and across Turtle Island, where we're seeing the continuation of fossil fuel expansion that poisons our landscapes, poisons our water systems, poisons the air, destroys critical habitat and biodiversity for keystone species that our communities have relied on for millennia. In addition to that, it is contributing massive GHGs to the atmosphere, which is further exacerbating the problems in our communities. This year alone, we have witnessed how the forest fires in northern so-called Canada have created a hellscape where every day we are worried about what the air quality is. But what is more alarming is in my community, which is in the Athabasca Delta, we are an Arctic Zone A community, an Arctic community in a delta, which is a marshland, and it was on fire this summer. A marshland was on fire. This is absolutely unacceptable. We are seeing not just the destruction of our territories for fossil fueled and corporate greed and colonial greed, but we are seeing the impacts of that coming through with the impacts of climate change exacerbating the problem. We need action now. We don't need ambitions to find technologies that are going to save us. We need to phase out of fossil fuels. We need to respect the rights of Indigenous communities, and we need to understand that our communities have critical knowledge systems and answers that can bring forward some of the most vital solutions for how to live in relationship and restore the balance that we so desperately need to address the climate crisis. We don't need colonial governments and corporations telling us what to do any longer. Thank you, Masicho.
Thank you, my relative Ariel Deranger from the Indigenous Climate Action in so-called Canada. Our next speaker is Anthony Rogers Wright. He's a spokesperson of the Black Hive. Again, the Black Hive is at the heart of the movement for Black lives. Anthony.
Thank you so much, Brother Tom. Thank you, sister, for that. So we are, of course, here to offer a collective opprobrium for demonstrably ineffective mechanisms or so-called false solutions. Yet one thing I learned during my time as policy coordinator with the Climate Justice Alliance, where I had the pleasure of working closely with many of the folk on this stage, many in the audience, and many who are watching online, is that it is impossible to understand the heart of the problem without possessing a comprehension of the problem's root causes. It's both imperative and requisite that we understand the root causes that lead too many, mainly white affluent actors in the climate movement and their political acolytes to ignore the dangers and ineffectiveness of carbon capture technologies and other forms of geoengineering so that we can deracinate them from our collective consciousness and end these distractions that act as inertia as it pertains to the real solutions we need to establish and maintain regenerative economies rooted in traditional indigenous knowledge, non-colonial feminism, and Black power. The brother Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, reminds us in his myths of coalitions that so-called coalitionists proceed under what's identified as three major myths or fallacies. The first one is the one that speaks most profoundly to me in the context of environmental policy and the overarching approach to the climate crisis. As Brother Ture reminds us, in the context of present-day America, the interests of Black people are identical with the interests of certain liberal, labor, and other reform groups. Those groups accept the legitimacy of the basic values and institutions of the society and fundamentally are not interested in a major reorientation of the society. In short, the myth assumes that what's good for so-called America is good for Black people. This fallacy must be confronted, invaded, and eviscerated from our mode of thinking if we have any chance at arriving at a junction of climate justice. And it must be stated from the outset that the utilization of these false solutions are really tools to resuscitate and maintain the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel racism. For years, fossil fuel cartels and their political acolytes at all levels of government, including actors in certain neoliberal big green environmental organizations, have inculcated too many with a myopic idea that false solutions like carbon capture sequestration, carbon capture utilization and storage, and direct air capture, and other forms of engineering can extenuate the impacts of fossil fuel operations and the climate crisis writ large. This is particularly pernicious for Black and African peoples in the United States and throughout the diaspora. Much like our indigenous siblings, the fossil fuel industry consistently targets our communities to act as their energy and economic sacrifice zones, a maleficent trend that vindicates the fact that the root causes of this climate crisis are white supremacy ideology, patriarchy, and colonization. And we also know that the fossil fuel industry are among the biggest proponents of these technologies, which is why the industry is more ebullient about the so-called Inflation Reduction Act than environmental and climate justice leaders. The billions of dollars that these cartels have already received and set to receive with this so-called Inflation Reduction Act is irrefutable proof that it is less a climate bill and more a poison pill for Black and Indigenous and poor communities. We at the Black Hive, along with our Indigenous partners, other people of color, and our radical white accomplices, will continue to fight the proliferation of these false solutions and their poisonous pipelines that put our communities at risk, as we saw in Yazoo County, Mississippi, still reeling from a carbon dioxide pipeline explosion that left many sick and infirmed. As we say in our Black Climate Mandate that I encourage all to read, quote, "The Black Hive was built to serve Black communities who bear the brunt of climate disaster and extreme weather events, and whose experiences are exacerbated by other economic factors such as poverty and systemic racism. The Black Hive proposes pro-Black climate policies and practices, builds alternatives to current harmful systems, and offers resources, data, and technology communications for disaster response to support local communities and Black-led organizations." I'll wrap up saying this mandate enjoins all of us to fight the bad and build the alternative systems necessary to confront and defeat this climate crisis. And as our brother Goldtooth mentioned yesterday, this includes confronting the actors who may look like us that are handpicked to do the bidding of alabaster puppet masters, pushing false solutions and continued fossil fuel racism that represent clear and present dangers to Indigenous sovereignty and the preservation of Black lives and communities. Fighting the root causes of the climate crisis and false solutions includes pushing back against, as Brother Glenn Ford characterized them, the Black misleadership class in our government, in our climate spaces, and in our communities. I'm going to end with my favorite James Baldwin quote from his opus, No Name in the Street, because the climate solutions we are pushing, just transition, food sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty, and Black power, among others, are rooted in truth. Baldwin wrote, "The truth which frees Black people will also free white people, but this is a truth which white people find very hard to swallow." The climate movement, world leaders of wealthier nations best figure out how to swallow this truth expeditiously, or it's going to get hot in here and much hotter everywhere else. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my brother. Our next speaker is Julia Bernal. Again, she's the executive director of the Pueblo Action Alliance, and these are a number of, I don't want to say activists, but like I said earlier, they're descendants of the Pueblo indigenous revolutionaries. Julie.
Yeah, thank you. Hinomopuyu. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, and also thank you for inviting, a Pueblo native to be on this panel with you all. I am the executive director, but I am not the only one here representing New Mexico. 37 people from New Mexico came out to New York this week because we have been an energy sacrifice zone for many, many generations. Our landscape is very resource rich, not just natural resources, but cultural resources. Our people have thrived as traditional land-based people for many generations. But unfortunately, we have also been a part of this economic trade-off system, being that uranium, oil and gas, minerals are all based in New Mexico. And so now as we're in the middle of climate negotiations on what the just transition is going to be, we are very central to what those negotiations are going to be, because a lot of the lithium, the hydrogen, the new energy investments in technology are going to come from our homelands. And so our delegation came with a message to New York that we were no longer going to be a sacrifice zone, and that we do not consent to this continued legacy of extraction, of exploitation, and of cultural genocide, to put very, very bluntly. But I'm here to talk a little bit more about our work in regards to hydrogen. I really, truly believe that folks need to start getting on the hydrogen chain to understand that it really does encompass all types of energy. It will take fossil fuels. It will take wind and solar. It will take using water. We're becoming a very, very arid environment because of the climate change. The sister talked about fires. We're very accustomed to that season, and it's only going to get exacerbated as our water scarcity continues to be more and more of a threat. We have been following the ways in which the New Mexico administration follows the Paris Climate Agreement and what is happening on the international platform. Very much so that we feel it is also our responsibility to be in that space, so that way we understand that how our natural and cultural resources are going to be pitted as a part of the climate financing and the financialization of nature. We're seeing false solutions being touted at this level, like clean hydrogen, low carbon fuels. That is still going to continue fossil fuel extraction. And so the colors of hydrogen really do matter here. And, I'm going to speak directly to the big environmental groups that want to compromise on endorsing green hydrogen. That stance ignores and decenters Indigenous frontline, grassroots, and youth leadership.
That's right.
And you can no longer speak on our behalf, because it is our lands and it's our people and it's our culture that is at stake.
That's right.
We are following a Western interstate regional hydrogen hub proposal that is going to be using dollars from the Inflation Reduction Act to fund these new types of projects by re-equipping existing infrastructure that is already in the state of New Mexico. We are being told that coal plants are being shut down, but they're not. They're being retired to be transformed into blue hydrogen facilities. They're wanting to inject liquid carbon underneath the ground. You are disrupting what has been placed there very meticulously by our spirits and our Creator. And so we are going to continue mobilizing a climate justice grassroots movement that centers ideologies of Indigenous stewardship, leadership, youth empowerment, and of course, the continued history of environmental justice in New Mexico. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Reminds me of the history of the Pueblo Revolt, But we have to stand up. Every speaker here comes from community. They come from organizations and alliances. We're standing up, we're speaking out on voices that have been marginalized and left out of the UN climate negotiations, but also locally, also nationally. So it's really good to have you here. Our next speaker, I'm proud to introduce, is Dawn Wells Clybourne, and she's the Executive Director of Push Buffalo. It's a member organization of and representing the Climate Justice Alliance. Push Buffalo advances racial, economic, environmental justice, and affordable housing in Buffalo, New York. Dawn.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good to see you all today. Again, my name is Dawn Wells Clybourne. I'm from Buffalo, New York, or better known as the Haudenosaunee land. I come representing hundreds of people crying out and very angry about what is going on back home. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear me. What is going on back home? Buffalo, New York is not just snow, wings, and bills. Buffalo is home to a population of 277 folks. 33% of the population is African American folks. We at Push Buffalo are centered in a community of practice as it relates to the just transition. And right now, what we're up against and what we're fighting for actively is the fossil fuel industry in our area that's better known as National Fuel Gas. National Fuel Gas right now has a scoping plan that is in direct contradiction to the People's Climate Law. That's the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that was passed in 2019. And this was hundreds of people that came out to pass this law. And it is not funded. That's another problem. But going back to National Fuel Gas, right now their scoping plan that is before the Public Service Commission has false solutions riddled all through it. They are supposed to be actively working towards a long-term plan that will convert over by 2050. All greenhouse gases will be reduced. And what is before us right now is the national fuel gas companies are setting an unprecedented example for other utilities, other gas utilities across the state and across the country, because they're the first ones to present this plan to the Public Service Commission. We need to really speak up because we have to, under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the greenhouse gases must be reduced under this law by a reduction of 40% by 2030 and 85% by 2050. That's New York State law. That is not a suggestion, that is a law. And it also requires that 35% of state investment goes directly to what the DEC calls disadvantaged communities, which the entire region of Buffalo and several regions throughout the country qualify where they're frontline communities. And so this is why it's very important, because those clean energy and efficiency investments can directly go to the solutions that organizations like ours, like PUSH Buffalo, that's People United for Sustainable Housing, have been working towards for several years in coalition space with Climate Justice Alliance, with several of the folks who are represented in this room and several folks that can't be here. And one of the solutions that I want to kind of, highlight, because often we're left out of the solutions table with these big green companies, but we already have been practicing them. And what we've done as part of our Just Transition practice is figure out what we could do where we are, So I just want to share that our West Side Homes project is a 49-unit, 13-site affordable housing project, but it's not just affordable housing, it is sustainable, it is efficient, it doesn't have any fossil fuel infrastructure at all. And so we're doing that, we're finishing up, we'll be finished by the end of this year, but it's just one example of what is possible as we deal with compounding crises, not just with, the false solutions from the fossil fuel industry, but we're also talking about compounding crises of housing. We have a housing crisis that is displacing people daily. The gentrification is right at our doorstep, and mental health is an issue with our folks. And when you compound all of these things together, you have to be able to provide supportive care for folks. And so that's what we hope to accomplish. And this project alone sets the example for the folks who are going to be funding, or who should be funding, our lawmakers, this law, that it is possible, that we do have the solutions. The out of gas pilot that we have is an induction stove pilot, where folks are telling us, and National Fuel Gas has a very aggressive campaign where they're telling folks that you can heat with gas, and you can heat with gas with your gas stoves, and that's not true. I was a resident that was impacted by the Buffalo blizzard last year, and it was not sufficient. It is not sustainable to heat with gas. It is very, very unsafe, and a lot of folks died and got very sick from it, and so that is not a solution. But we do have options. We can get induction stoves. We can put ground source heat pumps in our homes. We can put metal roofs, and community solar is a real thing if we have the funding for the law that we fought for and won. And so we have to keep fighting. We have to get it funded, and I encourage everyone to look into those solutions. I'll just end by saying that being part of the Just Transition framework and looking at our problems is not just environmental racism, it is not just housing injustices. This is a comprehensive problem that deals with how we survive and how we thrive as communities. We have the right to be healthy. We have the right to have joy. We have the right to look at everything as abundant, and we have the solutions right where we live in all of our respective communities. And we have shown and proven through all of the examples, through all of the work that we have done, that not only are these solutions scalable, but they can be replicated anywhere in the country. Small is all. That's what Adrienne Marie Brown said. And so if you start with the small, you will build on it, and everyone can get what they need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dawn. next speaker is Adrian Salazar. He's our policy director of the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. Adrian.
Can folks hear me? Yes, sir. Yeah. Thank you, Tom, and thanks to all of the speakers on this panel. I'm very honored to be here speaking with all of you. And so we're here this week primarily, partly because of the UN Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit that's happening tomorrow. And we know from what you've heard from some of my colleagues here already that the UN negotiations process on addressing the global climate crisis has been failing. It has been failing communities for 30 years, and we are seeing it in how people's lives are being disrupted, communities are being displaced, people are dying all over the world, from the Southwest to the Gulf South to the Global South. And you can see that the crisis that we're facing is a result of generations of colonialism and historic extraction. And you can see it in the inequity that continues to be reproduced by the so-called solutions that these governments are putting forward. And in these negotiations, the United States is failing to own up to its historic responsibility for its contribution to emissions that have produced this crisis. Global North countries and the United States are underscoring the injustice of this crisis in a crisis that is actually also unequally impacting Black, Indigenous, immigrant communities of color in the United States and all over the world. So global North countries in the United States simply owe impacted communities, vulnerable countries around the world, a climate debt, a historic climate debt, because their development has depended on the extraction of resources from Global South communities, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities everywhere. So the United States and other global North countries must take on their responsibility for these emissions. We are off track. We have seen the hottest summer on record basically everywhere, and here we are trying to get crumbs out of this process, right? And what they're throwing back at us, the United States and global North countries, are false solutions, as my colleagues have said. Now, the UN Secretary General Summit could end up in nothing. It could be just another show and dance, smoke and mirrors, but it is also an opportunity for governments like the US to actually own its responsibility. The US is gonna go in there and claim so-called climate leadership, but we have to see the truth that it has been expanding fossil fuels. It has been peddling false solutions like carbon capture and storage throughout this country. It's developing an infrastructure to peddle these false solutions and try to export them to other places around the world. Biden, in his first 2 years, has greenlit over 6,400 fossil fuel permits on public lands and waters. They have sold leases in the Gulf, in New Mexico, across the American West. They have approved natural gas terminals in Alaska, in the South, and they supported the locking in of the Mountain Valley Pipeline that many of our brothers and sisters in Appalachia have been resisting for years. Now, there was a report that was just released by Oil Change International this week that showed that of the proposed expansion of fossil fuels, only 5 countries are responsible for over 51%. And the US is poised to be #1 of those countries, proposed to over 1/3 of the potential oil and gas expansion in up to 2050. And if all of that oil and gas was burned, all of those fossil fuels, we are gonna shoot well beyond 1.5 degrees. And I'm telling you, that is the plan of these corporations and the plan of this government and governments like Canada and other wealthy countries. So the US and the global North must clean up its act. It must be the first and fastest to phase out fossil fuels. Now, the last thing I wanna say is that human rights has to be integrated into these solutions, into these negotiations. We have seen another bloody year all over the world where frontline defenders of lands and waters are being murdered. Their hits are being put on people by these corporations. 177 environmental defenders were killed this year. And then here in the United States, we have our own governments, the national government and the local government criminalizing protest. You see in Cop City, people being arrested, RICO charges being filed, conspiracy theories trying to blacken the records of protests. And so this is a serious threat on our democracy and our ability for folks to defend their lands and waters. Every living being has a right to clean air. Every living being has a right to clean water, to housing, to healthy food, and a good life. That is what we are here fighting for. So to sum up, while this summit is happening tomorrow and is leading the path to another corporate-captured negotiations in Dubai in the winter, we are here to demand that the United States own its historic responsibility for emissions, it pay climate reparations to the communities and countries that are most impacted, it prioritizes the phase out of fossil fuels, and stop peddling false climate solutions all across the country and across the world, and that there be no climate justice. There is no climate justice without centering human rights.
Thank you. Thank you, Adrian. Our next speaker organization is based here in Manhattan and in New York City. Mahiba Ahmed. She's a community organizer with Drum. Desis, Rising Up and Moving.
Hello, everyone, and assalamu alaikum. So glad to be here. Thank you for having us, and thank you for being here. The climate crisis is a global issue. The climate crisis knows no borders. We, at Desis Rising Up and Moving, organize and work with South Asian and Indo-Caribbean working class immigrant communities, communities that have faced the worst effects of the climate crisis. We have and continue to be at the front lines in our homelands and here in the US. Many of us have been displaced from our ancestral lands, forced to migrate and work low-wage jobs in New York City to support both our families here and back home. We are hard hit when climate disasters like Hurricane Sandy flood our basement homes and cyclones ravage our villages in Pakistan and Bangladesh. Millions of people in South Asia are impacted and lost every year to climate change. Heavy monsoon rains in Pakistan have claimed the lives of 50 people this year. And this comes after a year of devastating floods in 2022 that took more than 1,700 lives, displaced over 33 million, and caused damages of around $16 billion to an already crippled economy. In the state of Assam in India, deadly flash floods affected nearly 500,000 people, forcing thousands to flee their homes. Dhaka, Bangladesh, has become a megacity with thousands of climate migrants hoping to survive after leaving their flooded rural homes. Facilities and infrastructures are increasingly inadequate and will be insufficient as we absorb more climate-displaced people. South Asian and Indo-Caribbean countries are experiencing an increase in climate change-induced rainfalls, droughts, and soaring temperatures, making these the world's most vulnerable regions impacted by global warming. Our communities have contributed the least to the man-made climate disasters, but continue to suffer the most as a result of this change. For example, Pakistan has contributed only 0.4% to the total greenhouse gases since 1959, whereas countries in the global north have exceeded their quotas by 90%. The capital and resources that the global north, like the US, has acquired has been accumulated through a systemic exploitation of our peoples and dispossession of our lands. Hundreds of years of colonization and ongoing imperial extraction has produced this climate crisis. The global north has more because the global south has been made to have less. This is climate apartheid. Our communities have been stripped of the resources we need to recover and prepare for future crises through an unceasing, relentless drive to accumulate capital and maximize profits. Colonization and the North's imperial adventures have in fact been a primary reason behind a delay in both industrialization and climate adaptation in our countries. And so even though the climate crisis is global, the fight against climate justice is a biased one. The increasing number of extreme climate disasters in our homelands have been a result of industrialization in the global north, built on the back of capitalist practices that incentivize burning fossil fuels. We have had enough of the colonizers and imperialists trying to pass off their false solutions of carbon capture, clean hydrogen, zero-emission nuclear energy, etc., as the way out of this crisis. We reject these solutions and the basis on which they stand. We demand that the global north cancel our debts, debts that have been amassed as a result of not being able to recover economically after mass destruction in the wake of climate catastrophe. We demand an end to the debt trap. Pakistan's debt trap was spearheaded by military dictators and sham democratic governments who offer strategic debt in the region to the US and its allies during the Cold War and the War on Terror, and agreed to advance neoliberal economic practices by cutting down on public spending and welfare. We demand the leash be cut from the IMF's structural adjustment packages that have always been tied to liberalization of trade and finance, privatization of state-owned industries, drastic cuts to public subsidies, and the commodification of nature. We demand climate reparations and repair. We also demand that our countries be provided with resources that were stolen from us. We demand the fund and technology to build climate-resilient infrastructures. We unite with our Indigenous, Black, Brown siblings as we demand the global north end fossil fuels, hold companies responsible for polluting and killing our planet. Reparations and repair are the only way forward to a just transition. A complete transformation of the political and economic system is the only real solution to the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohiba. I want to speak to the issue and concerns of the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a recent United States federal law that funnels billions of dollars to climate fault solutions like carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, biomass, biogas, critical minerals, carbon markets, conservation, forests, biodiversity, soil offset regimes, and nuclear energy. Woven into these laws are provisions of building a U.S. infrastructure, a huge infrastructure of geoengineering techno-fixes and carbon trading regimes that will allow the polluters, the fossil fuel industry, to greenwash their dirty energy practices, falsely saying they are going carbon neutral and meeting net zero emission goals. These are lies. One of these false solutions is carbon markets. Carbon markets operate under false and unscientific assumption that offsetting emissions and selling permits to pollute will reduce global warming. Studies have shown these false solutions do not cut emissions at source at the levels that we need to keep the global emissions reduction goal of 1.5 Celsius. Mother Earth is warning us. She's warning us right now that we are out of time. Measures to drastically reduce extraction and phase out fossil fuels must be the forefront of all environmental, climate, and economic-related policies. That's why we're here. That's why we're here in New York City right now as Indigenous, Black, and people of color. We are confronting and calling out the realities of racism and colonialism in climate policy with opportunistic disaster capitalism, the financialization, commodification, and privatization of nature and biodiversity of our Mother Earth, and the growing techno-utopianism of unproven technical fixes with governmental and corporate practices and major bank investments, banks that are based here in the United States that continue their profound destructive impacts inflicted upon Indigenous peoples of the United States, Canada, the Pacific, and the world. This is not only horrifying, but it's a form of genocide. We have been at these United Nations hallways since 1998 when I went and taken delegation after delegation. The IRA is not a climate or environmental justice law. There are some good provisions in it, yes, but majority of the programs provide incentives to dirty energy and ineffective conservation programs like the Biden 30 by 30 offsets program. The IRA is called the climate deal, but it's a wholesale investment into destructive climate fault solutions designed to line the pockets of the fossil fuel and energy industries and cultivate the growth of an extractive industry in this country. So we have to put a stop to this. We have to stand in front of this, not only with our bodies, but we have to put up our ceremonies in prayer, asking that the Kashandas and our Unchi Makal and the spirits have to put a stop to this. And we're going to do that in this movement of bringing people of color, Black, and frontline communities, and labor, and the workers as well, together in our youth to develop a plan in preparation of Dubai. And the IRA is a disappointment. We know that the U.S. and the Biden's climate envoy will be presenting this IRA as a shining example of how they are putting billions to address the climate crisis. But they're not addressing U.S. commitment to the climate debt and contribution to the much-needed loss and damage fund of developing countries and our relatives of the local communities and Indigenous peoples of the global South. So we have to stand together. And, the president right now, he has to be held accountable. The law with the IRA does not absolve this president from the responsibility to declare a climate emergency and address the crisis at the source. We must pressure President Biden to declare a climate emergency and use his executive powers to stop the extractive industries from causing more violence, death, and destruction. Biden must declare a climate emergency under the National Emergencies Act and keep fossil fuels in the ground. Now, he must make that decision before the climate envoy of the United States colonial government goes to Dubai, COP28. Thank you. We only have one Mother Earth, and we have to work together to protect her. Itaki Awasi. So, for the press, I think I'm turning over to Dallas.
My name is Dallas Goldtooth, and I've been asked here to help moderate a Q&A session with our speakers. So I'll ask another round of applause for the speakers and the comments that were given thus far. This is being broadcast as well as recorded, so the hopes is that a number of organizations have their videos here so that a lot of this you can be shared and disseminated after today's event. So the first question is a general question for all speakers. Not doesn't have to be one person. It could be everyone that can answer it if you want. But the Biden administration has said it has worked with BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color organizations in developing its climate policy. Do your organizations have opinion on that climate policy and how the Biden administration has said they've worked with BIPOC communities?
That's a very salient question. First of all, it's important to understand that most of us didn't even know about the Inflation Reduction Act until it was announced. So this idea, that he was working with BIPOC organizations and communities, who are these organizations? Who are these communities? And who are they accountable to? Those questions have not been answered. And he can't say that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, we see exposés released about the 5 or 6 white architects of the Inflation Reduction Act bragging that they are the architects of it. As we have, it's been said before, nothing for us without us. There is no way that many of the organizations, including IEN, GGJ, Push Buffalo, and the others, would have allowed for a piece of legislation that opens up 600 million acres of the Gulf of Mexico to oil and gas drilling, and as well as all the false solutions, billions of dollars, and allow that to go to fruition. So we're just going to have to call that what it is, which is a straight up fallacy and a lie. And the last thing that I will say on that is that President Biden didn't even listen to his own White House Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, which said this is an example of what would not benefit a community: carbon capture, sequestration, direct air capture, and other technologies. And all we've seen so far since this IRA has been signed into law, Willow. We've seen liquefied natural gas exports in the Gulf of Mexico to fund this feckless, unnecessary war in Eastern Europe. And you're not going to get away with holding, essentially a minstrel show in your rose garden to sign a piece of feckless and worthless environmental justice legislation when you're not living up to that. So if you're not even listening to your own so-called WEJAC, you're definitely not listening to the communities here. Last thing I'll say on that is that you got to stop reading the Princeton University reports, Jesse Jenkins reports. Go to IEN's website and read IEN's analysis if you want to know the truth about the Inflation Reduction Act. Go to Just Solutions collective website and look at the analysis of people like Sylvia Chi, who's the GOAT on all of this stuff. Go to Climate Justice Alliance's website, because the groups who are pushing this, the ones who have already endorsed Biden, they understand that he is so weak on climate that they had to coalesce around him immediately, rather than upholding an example like we see with our siblings at UAW who are holding this president to account. So again, it had nothing to do, it wasn't for us, it wasn't by us, and that's why you're seeing so much pushback on it now and so much fear about it, right? How is it that 77% of the people in so-called United States don't even know about the Inflation Reduction Act? These are people up here who work with sharing knowledge and sharing wisdom. If we had anything to do with that act, Black, brown, Indigenous, poor white folk, brown people would know everything about it. It's because they don't know what's in it, which is why we have to be up here right now.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel wish to respond to the question? I can repeat it if needed. By all means.
I'm from Canada land, from the north of the Medicine Line. I think this is a really important thing. I can't speak directly to, the claims to developing the climate policy or the Inflation Reduction Act with BIPOC communities, but this is a common tactic that we're seeing within colonial governments, within the climate discourse at large, is this claim that they are working with BIPOC communities, with the most marginalized and the most impacted by the climate crisis, as a way to posture, as a way to try to diffuse the movement that our people have been advocating for the past 30 plus years within these spaces. We have been advocating for a human rights-based approach, for upholding the rights of nature and the rights of Indigenous communities within these forums for 30 plus years. And we began to win. We began to win when we started to be able to take over those hallways and have our voices heard. But now what they've done is they've tried to co-opt this by making claims like we're working with BIPOC communities by looking for tokens that they can put in front of the microphone, in front of these spaces. And we're seeing this in the development of climate policy in north of the border in so-called Canada. We're seeing how they're trying to take our language and co-opt it and pervert it to further their issues, to allow colonial expansion to continue, to allow extractivism to continue, to allow the fact that while we are all struggling with the everyday consequences of capitalism, when we see it in our cost of living every day, but what's most alarming is that we're seeing that climate solutions are being reduced to a capitalist approach.
That's right.
And so I just want to really, really warn people that when you have those people that are developing these policies and finding token voices to stand behind them, that you should be wary.
Yes.
You should go directly to those grassroots organizations and the folks that are on stage to find out what the people actually want, what the people are actually demanding, and what we need to do to address this crisis, and not take carte blanche that what the government is saying is true, because they're the ones that created this problem. They're not the ones that are going to solve the problem.
Yeah, real quick, adding to that, definitely, Anthony, what you said is right on, and in Canada as well. I've been at these UN meetings, and it's interesting how Canada comes in to partner up with the United States, and they actually use Big Brother. U.S. uses little brother, Canada, but they're usually together. And we see that as energy policy, as the pollution that comes out of the tar sands. I mean, that's devastating, and that's where Ariel's relatives come from. But that pipeline, we know, has impacted our communities as it goes south. But what I want to say, not only the Biden administration, who campaigned on environmental justice, on equity issues, who has violated most all of those mandates that he's put on the table. One of the ones that we're very critical on as a federal initiative is the Justice 40. Justice 40. And ironically, you could say they must meet with the billionaires. They must work with the people also that are throwing down big money outside of government. It was not unusual for me to see Jeff Bezos, as he threw down big money and created the Earth Fund. He put $100 million right away on 4 large non-governmental organizations, environmental groups that are supporting what we are denouncing here. $100 million he put on the table, helping them in their campaign. Not only that, he came full round to come to Black, Indigenous, people of color organizations. I'll throw down money on your funding needs, $2 million, $4 million, $8 million, $12 million to help you to get involved on supporting and getting involved with your constituency on Justice 40. Indigenous Environmental Network turned down $7 million offer. We turned down $7 million because it was a scam. And it's co-opting and dividing our movement right now.
That's right.
So these are things that we have to be conscious of and strategic on how we move through this struggle and confusion and division that's happening in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you for that. The next question is actually kind of may extend that comment, that last comment there. President Biden and many other global leaders, including the UN Secretary General, has stated that the private sector has a big part to play in confronting the climate crisis. Do you support that opinion, or what changes need to be made in order for the private sector to be properly involved? I want to create space for some relatives who haven't spoken yet.
Okay. Is this on? The private sector is responsible for the climate crisis. And they don't speak on behalf of the people. We see, the national platform, but also the regional and local, also following, in the footsteps that the private public sector plays a part in climate solutions. But that's not always the case because their interest is to make profit. It's to continue that infinite growth that is capitalism. And so we are, and I'm sure and I've heard it throughout the whole press conference, that we are demanding that community-based solutions be centered, small as all, right? I mean, you look at other geographies across the world that, don't have like the wealth consolidated in their nation states, but are working to provide resources and amenities for their communities, and it's all land-based, it's all community-based. And so, no, the private sector doesn't care about us either. We're in New York. There's decisions being made here in New York, and our lands are hundreds, thousands of miles away. They have no connection to our place. And so, the private sector, get out of here.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. +1 to that. I don't think that the private sector thinks about our communities or cares about our communities, and it is the privatization that has exacerbated the effects of the climate crisis back in our countries. It is, like I talked about, the IMF structural adjustment plans come with a deal of privatization of hospitals and education and all of these things back in our homelands, which forces the people who cannot sustain themselves economically back home to migrate. And when they come here, they are people from our communities that are working here as cab drivers, as delivery workers, as construction workers, and privatization just makes all of those impacts worse on them. So no, privatization does not think about the climate crisis. It only exacerbates it. It only oppresses our communities more.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I could just, can you hear me? Yeah? If I could just add one thing. Yes, absolutely. Private sector, get out of here. And I want to lift up that the United States in these negotiations in the UN space is trying to sell all of this false solutions technology to the world, and it's designing mechanisms, financial products that are actually trying to profit over the climate crisis, trying to put money into the pockets of these banks and corporations and international institutions. And for example, last year in the COP, in the UN Climate Conference, John Kerry announced this thing called the Energy Transition Accelerator, which is this scheme that is creating new carbon credits. And the incentives, when we talk about the private sector, the incentives are all backwards. They are about selling carbon credits to corporations to offset their existing emissions, to create a pool of funding that will then be given to developing countries to help them in their adaptation and mitigation. They're trying to sell blood money to developing countries. And this is what they're selling to the private sector to increase capital for the energy transition. These are the things that our government in the United States, this colonial government, is trying to ship everywhere around the world. So when we say private sector, get out of here, that is what we're talking about.
Thank you very much. Any other comments on that one? All right, a few more questions left. Some say that New York State has been leading the way in state-level climate policy. The question is, are there models that can or should be replicated at a larger scale. And this is probably for those of our relatives who represent constituencies or have worked in constituencies here in New York.
I'll take a stab at it. Yeah, New York State, similar to the way that our federal government is operating, is not doing things out of the kindness of their heart. They're doing them because the people are speaking up and demanding that there's change. The problem, as I mentioned earlier, is that it's one thing to get legislation. It's one thing to conceive a thing, to get legislation. It's another thing to actually have funding to make that law real. It's another thing to actually hold accountability to the people who hold the power. And so, like, back to speaking about privatization, what is the motive? The motive of the people that are making money is to make more money. The motive of the lawmaker that is tasked with being responsible is not necessarily to the people that put them in place. And so to that end, I say, no, New York State is not really a partner. They're being made to be a partner, and there's more work to be done on that front. It just so happens that there's enough voices, that there's enough coalition and enough organization to push these things forward. And so I think that there are some actors that have been more receptive because we've been co-designing in some shape, fashion, or form based on community-based organizing to get to the table, to create a table, and then create a chair to sit at the chair and the table.
No, thank you, Sister Dawn. First, we have to give love and recognize the New York Renews Coalition. Sister Dawn and I are part of that. Our dear brother Adrian also did a lot of work with that. And they are the coalition that is largely responsible for what you're referring to, Brother Dallas, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019, which was signed into law by the former governor, whose name I won't say right now. We also have to talk about some of the compromises that were necessary because of the capitalist system that we're in. Brother Goldtooth, discussed so-called carbon markets. We are in the midst right now in New York State of designing regulations for a cap, trade, and invest system that'll largely be necessary to fund the so-called climate law that Sister Dawn talked about, because right now, as it stands, it's an unfunded mandate. I like to joke around and say that it was the radical Marxists and socialists at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA. They're the ones who said that we're going to need $10 to $15 billion a year to properly fund and implement the CLCPA. What we are seeing now is a lot of reneging. A lot of reneging. Somebody woke up one day and saw that, like, oh my gosh, we're getting close to these mandates, not goals, as Sister Dawn said, mandates, and maybe we don't want to follow them anymore. So the governor locks us in impetuously, I might add, without any environmental review, in New York State being this Northeast hydrogen hub. And we're being told that that is part of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act to reduce emissions, even though NYSERDA did a pilot project with hydrogen, and it was found to increase emissions of co-pollutants like nitrogen oxides, which are largely located in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. So, I mean, it's one thing to cut the ribbon, drink the champagne, and be like, we passed the most ambitious climate law in the country. That might be true, but the implementation phase is very, very important. And now we're seeing lawmakers of both parties, I might add, the corporate and deadly duopoly is real, especially in New York State. The biggest recipients of fossil fuel money are both Democrats. Right. Two of those Democrats are what they're trying to do is adulterate the climate law now by switching how we accurately account for methane emissions, a 20-year model, and switch that to a 100-year model. Why would they do that? And who does that benefit, right? And I think, like, the last thing that I'll say on this is that, as Sister Dawn said, I mean, we're not going to depend, everyone keeps saying, oh, the Inflation Reduction Act will help pay for the CLCPA, but there's no proof of that. And due respect to Chuck Schumer, due respect to Kathy Hochul, the governor, you're not even in a position to make that decision, right? That's a dude named John Podesta. So, I mean, like how are you making these promises to fund a climate law that, like we're ready. I mean, my other organizations that I'm affiliated with in New York Renews, we're ready to go to court if we have to. This is the law, and it was created and fought for by grassroots organizations who I want to give love to, local organizations like PUSH, New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, UPROSE, New York Communities for Change, Catskill Mountain Keeper, Long Island Progressive Coalition, so many who are not going to allow this to happen. So I would have to agree with Sister Dawn that the reneging that is happening right now is forcing me to say that it is no longer, like, it's in jeopardy of being, as Sister Dawn said, an unfunded and unenforced mandate.
Thank you very much. We're at our last question. I'll start on that end. Actually, it's an open question for everybody here. And please remember, we'll keep our time down, but I want to allow everyone to have a word here. But the question is very general and very direct, is what are your positions on climate reparations? And is there, and this is maybe a secondary question that you may want to link in there, is there a link with climate finance? I know we had talked about climate finance just now in a good discussion about the private sector, but what are your positions on climate reparations?
Well, they need to happen now. Of course, I'm only going to speak in our experience in New Mexico, but we have, dealt with a historic legacy of dirty energy production and cultivation that has yet to still be cleaned up. Yes. And that is what needs to happen. We can create economies around cleanup and remediation. We really can. We can create jobs for all of the amount of cleanup that needs to happen, just even in the state of New Mexico. But across the whole, across Turtle Island, we could be, investing in those types of economies that, clean up the mess that they left behind. So, and there.
Yes, I think I also described it with numbers, how, the global north is responsible for the creation of the climate crisis in the global south. The colonization, the extraction that happened because of colonization, taking our resources and the land dispossession that happened is why we are in such a vulnerable state. We did not want to be in a place where we are right now. We were forced to be in this place. And yes, the climate reparations need to happen now if we, as a whole, are thinking about just transition. A just transition cannot happen without climate reparations.
I'll just be real quick because I spoke. Absolutely, yes. I think that any climate reparations program must also include a program of free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous people all around the world. And the reason why that's important is because, ironically, it's a delicious irony that all the minerals that are needed for the renewable energy revolution are located on Indigenous lands. So we have to have a proactive form of climate reparations, and that's got to be free, prior, and informed consent.
Yeah, I dug up some language that we put together in the climate finance report on our IEN website. The hidden agenda behind new climate finance and funding mechanisms are to facilitate the absorption of climate change policy further into the private sector. And this relates to number 5. There is no exchange for the violence of CO2 colonialism. Yes to Indigenous sovereignty, yes to land back, Indigenous jurisprudence, and climate reparations, not climate finance, though. Climate finance cannot possibly result in securing Indigenous people's sovereignty and jurisprudence. Territorial rights, demarcation of ancestral lands are true reparations for Indigenous peoples and local communities because the violence of climate change far outweighs what can be measured in dollars. Climate finance is not designed to deliver resources directly to impacted communities in the global south and north. Instead, climate finance aims to silence communities and redirect crucial funding into an extractive economic system.
I think I really want to play off all of these comments. I think this is really, really an important conversation, and it's one that's going to be a hot topic in Dubai, likely part of the conversations that we'll see at this Climate Ambition Summit. Because right now, when we talk about climate reparations and loss and damage negotiations, there are no mechanisms that protect the rights of Indigenous peoples. This is about states paying other states for climate reparations, upholding colonial power. This is not about money going directly to those that are impacted. And right now, there is no language to protect the rights of Indigenous communities. And this is so alarming. Last week was the celebration of the 16th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and no one was talking about it. And this is the bottom. This is Thomas, Joseph, and I don't know, there he is. Last week, we were on a webinar, and he said something that is so important. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is not the ceiling, it's the floor. This is the bare minimum standards that we're trying to reach. And when we talk about climate reparations, we're not talking about upholding legal frameworks and the rights of Indigenous peoples or Indigenous jurisprudence. We're not talking about getting the money to those that are directly impacted, like the folks in Pakistan or the folks that are dealing with some of the most deplorable climate impacts. This is going to states. This is about a climate finance mechanism, and we have to advocate for there to be true human rights mechanisms, true mechanisms for allowing us to have grievances from the people, not from the colonial states. The people need to have access to a grievance mechanism that says when our rights are not being upheld, whether that's Indigenous rights, human rights, or the rights of the community impacted people. This is not enough what we're doing. We are not even scratching the bottom of what the bare minimum standard should be. We are not even there yet. We're just talking about it and giving it lip service. We need real action, not a bunch of empty promises.
Ashe, amen, and hallelujah. I just want to say, like, climate reparations, to even think about that term, I think is a little bit presumptuous. How can you repair the damage that you've done when the damage is so deep, it's so seated, it's ingrained in our DNA, it goes back generations upon generations upon generations of harm and oppression? I think about the systems. You know, it takes roots. So you go back to the root cause of why we are having to repair the damage of a climate problem that we did not create. And so it's not just about throwing the money at the solution. It's not just about, you know, oh, okay, New York State, you have to fund this climate law. It is about really dismantling the systems, because we know how to govern ourselves. And so when we experiment and we figure out that we can govern ourselves, that we have the solutions, then what do we need you for? And you know, when I think about the fact that here we are representing organizations that are doing the work that our governments should be doing, we shouldn't even exist as organizations, because we should have a functional government that's doing what it should be supposed to be doing for and by and of the people. And so my comment to climate reparations is not just money. My comment is dismantle the systems. I'm a systems girl. That's how I think. And when I look at all of the problems, it's like we're throwing money and we're throwing this here and there, and the people that are impacted are not getting what they need, and they will never get what they need as long as we're accountable to a system that is not designed for us.
It's hard to add to what all my comrades have already said, but yes, we need climate reparations. And I want to name again, it's really important to hear how our governments are talking about this in these spaces. And in an interview, John Kerry said that he was asked, is the U.S. going to support climate reparations, payments to the loss and damage fund that is being negotiated? He said no. Absolutely under no circumstances is the U.S. going to pay climate reparations. And I hate to bring him into the room. We've heard Biden's name into the room. It's like they're here in this press conference. But we have to understand what the people who are trying to undermine our communities, our sovereignty, our lives are doing, and what they're trying to put on the table with very powerful actors and corporations. And the loss and damage fund that is being negotiated in the UNFCCC was a victory of Global South and countries and organizations who are demanding climate reparations. It has the real risk of being co-opted into existing colonial financial institutions like the World Bank. That is the proposal on the table, that it be part of a fund in the World Bank, and just reproduce the financialization of the climate crisis, like Tom and others are talking about, of how corporations are looking at this crisis, are looking at the disasters, are looking at people's lives being lost and saying, how can we make more money off of this? That is what our enemies are trying to do with what is ahead of us. And so when we say we want reparations, yes, we have to keep fighting for it. We have to push these crumbs to not actually be adding to the destruction of our communities, and fight for actual restitution, demand real ownership of the responsibility for historic climate debts, and that none of this can be repeated. That's a part of reparations. If you say, I apologize for what I did, and then you do it again, that's not reparations. So there has to be accountability, there has to be a comprehensive plan, and that's why we are gonna continue to push for full, complete reparations.
It's not working. Check, check. So you support climate reparations? Okay, cool. Thank you. With notes. Gotcha. I would ask our attendees here to give another round of applause for all of our speakers here. The comments and opinions expressed, thank you so much. I'm gonna pass it back to my father here, to Tom, to close us out in a good way.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to my son Dallas Goldtooth. He's one of the actors with Reservation Dogs. But we have another actor here, actress, Casey Camp. Can you stand, please? If the media wants to look. We're proud of our Native people who are in the industry of acting. So it's good to have them both here. Thank you very much. One thing I wrote down in all the presentations, and thank you very much, all the speakers here, it was about dignity. What is it we're demanding? Something as simple. Allow our people to have dignity from wherever we come, whether it's Black folk communities, people of color communities, poor white folk communities, labor who are struggling right now. We have to have dignity. And whether it's in a UN system that prides itself on human rights instruments, and we have to fight within the UN system and all its organs and demand human rights time and time again. Not many people know that the U.S. Paris Agreement that was passed and adopted in 2015 in Paris, we had to fight for language on human rights. We had to fight for language on the collective rights and inherent rights of indigenous peoples. And we fought that it be in the operative text. And so the compromise that the governments gave with the World Bank sitting back, financial institutions, and corporations, extractive industry, keep it in the preamble text. Preamble text has no meat and power to it. We are still fighting to this day. People were telling us, large NGOs, well, back off, you all. At least we get something. It's the get something NGOs that we have to always struggle with. We can strengthen it later. That was in 2015. And we're still fighting to strengthen the language on the rights of indigenous peoples in the operative text. I'm not going to get into details, but you can look up Article 6 section of the Paris Accord, Paris Agreement, and that involves what everyone talked about, carbon markets. and the struggle trying to get language in that operative section on rights, the same fight. Strong language, no. So I heard dignity. Thank you very much for lifting that up. I feel very proud sitting up here with you all. We've been in many different meetings together, and everything that you've said has gone out to the world to a large degree. Thank you for our group that put this together. Many here formed ITR. It takes roots as an alliance of alliances. We kind of stepped back from that role, but we did commit when it comes to the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Conference of the Parties, but also events like this, we're going to come together and unite our voices and amplify our voices under the Alliance of Alliances, ITR. So as Indigenous Environmental Network, we are part of ITR, Grassroots of Global Justice Alliance, so we thank the ITR team, including Climate Justice Alliance and many others that are at this table of being part of the planning for a press conference like this and our events at the new school. So thank you very much. We have an event later today that you can find somewhere. If someone wants to quickly mention that to the press, you should come to that wherever you are, because we have something to say to you. Thank you very much. Okay, he wants a picture of us. Where do you